Hey everyone, welcome to Singularity Computers Custom Wiring Part 2. I'm calling this video Length and Volume. This is the second part in a new series I'm doing, a detailed and ongoing custom wiring guide, something I've been intending on doing on my channel for a long time. In Part 1 I covered in detail the tools and components you are going to need to build your own custom cables. Make sure you check that video out because this video is closely connected, and in this guide I'm starting with the basics because that is the part that is the most difficult. Getting started is always the most difficult part, and for a lot of people this is definitely the most daunting part, because if you get any of this wrong, this can become a very time-consuming and expensive little exercise. So the first problem you are faced with is figuring out what you are going to need. And the second problem is figuring out how much of each component you are going to need, which is obviously what we are covering in this video. And I thought I'd dedicate a video to this because it is quite involved. Some of it is just simple math. Some of it is having a knowledge of the components you are going to be using. And some of it I have some very simple and straightforward techniques for to help you out. Now always one of the first things that I do when I start building a system is figure out the custom cables, because it's something you really need to have figured out quite early in a build, otherwise it's going to hold you up later on, because there's a lot of materials and time involved. Now the only cables that I concern myself with to begin with are the cables for the core components. That is what I call them, the 24-pin, 8-pin EPS and 4-pin ATX and the PCIe. The rest of the cables I don't worry about until later, and I don't actually normally do them until the very last thing. It's usually the last thing I do in a build is the rest of the custom cables. What we're going to start with here today is figuring out exactly how much wire and sleeve we are going to need for this build. To figure this out, the first thing you need is about 2 meters of 16 or 18 gauge wire, a 1 meter ruler and something to write onto. I like to use a pen and paper because I just find it's quick and easy when I'm building systems, but you could just as easily use a phone or a computer. I do actually transfer this to my computer later. Now because I always have a lot of projects going on and I have to be careful not to get them confused, I write down the power supply brand, model, and then you can see I have written down the different cable types and how much of each cable. Now, to know this, you're first of all going to need to know which power supply you are going to be using, which graphics cards, and which motherboard. So let's take a look at the motherboard to start with. Obviously just a single 24-pin unless you're doing dual power supplies, but even then there's a bunch of configurations you can do. That's probably something we'll talk about in a future video actually. But the 8-pin EPS and 4-pin ATX, you can see that we have one of each for this motherboard. Be careful that there are no other power connections to the motherboard. This board does have one. It's a 6-pin PCIe. The graphics cards, we have 2 8-pin PCIe per graphics card. So you can see I have all of that written down. I also have SATA and Molex written down, but that is always something that I figure out later and we're going to get to towards the end of this video. So let's move on to figuring out how much wire and sleeve we're going to need for this build. So many people ask me how I get my lengths for my custom cables. Well, it's really very simple. I have a very straightforward and effective technique for this. To be able to figure out exactly how much wire and sleeve you are going to need, you obviously need to know your cable lengths, which you need to know anyway because you're going to be building those cables. To figure this out, you need to have your case, motherboard, graphics cards, and power supply. And you need to have those components installed into the case. So basically where this build is up to now minus the water cooling components. And this is what the wire is for. You need to route it exactly where you're going to be routing your cables. So let's start with the 24-pin. It's hardwired for this power supply, but it doesn't matter. We still need to figure out the length because it might be too long or too short. So I'm going to push the wire right in exactly where it's going to be coming from, and now I'm routing it exactly where it needs to go. And you really need to think about this carefully because once you do it, it's pretty much set in stone, and your cable routings are extremely important. You know, you need to be thinking about other things, such as possibly your water cooling loop, where it's going to be running, if the cable is going to be in the way, how you want to route the cable around the back of the build, which we'll take a look at now. So you need to be on both sides of the system for this. And it does help if you have two people so that someone can hold it on one end while you deal with the other end. But I always do it on my own. So I'm going to have a good look back here and just think about anything else that might be in the way of where I might want to route the 24-pin cable. But I think we can take a fairly direct routing. I mean, that's what you want to do. The ultimate goal with the cables, just like anything, I mean, is just being a minimalist. If you want a clean build, you need to be as minimal as possible without going too short where it's going to start pulling on the connections. But a lot of thought needs to go into this. You know, you need to be thinking about the amount the cable is actually capable of bending as well. For example, you know, you can see here with this 24-pin cable, you can only bend it so far. So you need to be careful with wire because, I mean, it's so easy to just go into the connector at the other end and bend it really tight and think, oh, that's a great routing. But in the real world, you know, when it's done, you don't want to really go any tighter than that. And that takes up a good 70 millimeters. So, okay. So I'm going to give it a little bit where it comes out of the power supply to loop out. And then I'm going to take a direct routing up to here. So I'm just looking at where the connector is on the other side. There's not much to clip onto here, you know, even for cable ties. So I need to consider that. Now that I have my length at the top, I have my loop at the top, I have a nice straight run here. So all the way back to here, it's exactly as I want it. I just need to check that I've still got the correct length. Actually, not quite. I've pulled it a little bit too tight. So I'm adding a bit more at the bottom. So I'll just show you the amount that I'm going to loop it here. And remember that the less wire strands there are, the more tightly you can loop it. So for example, with a 4-pin ATX, you can loop it very, very tight. And you do need to up at the top of the build as well. So that is about where I want it. Now, something else you need to make sure that you do is go from the furthest point on the connector on the power supply, the furthest point away, to the furthest point away on the connector that you are running to. So the power supply down the bottom, as far away as I can is this top one up here. So that way you will definitely get the length you need, because it's okay if it's slightly longer, but if it's slightly shorter, you have a problem. So I've now marked off with just my finger and thumb exactly the length that I want that cable at. And I'm just going to measure it off on the ruler. And what we have is 620 millimeters. Now that I have the length of the 24-pin cable, I would normally continue and get the lengths for all of the other cables. But I think you get the idea. You can see that cable routing plays a huge part in this. The cable routings that you choose now, you are going to need to stick to. And I am tempted to talk about cable routing at this point, but I think I'll leave it for another video. I should definitely dedicate a video to cable routing. There is just so much to talk about, but a quick example here on the graphics card. So for the PCIe cables, I'm probably going to do what most people would do, which is route them straight down and probably through this opening here and then down obviously to the power supply. But take a look at the other ways you could route them. You could go out and around the outside here. You could even go straight up, or you could bring them both into the center and then go out, and that would be really clean. Actually, I might even do that for this build, because that will probably, well, it will look cleaner than going straight down. And there's a lot of ways you can do that too. Like you can, have one going this way and one going that way, and intertwine them and do all sorts of cool stuff. So there's really a lot to think about when it comes to cable routing. We're now going to figure out the exact amount of wire and sleeve we need for the 24-pin cable. And obviously you can do this exact same thing for all of the other cables in your build. So we know the length is 620 millimeters. All we need to do is times the length by the amount of wire strands that we have, which is obviously 24. It is actually 23, but 24 will do for this. And it works out to be roughly 15 meters. But always get yourself a little bit of extra. I always go about 10 meters of extra sleeve and 10 meters of extra wire in case of mistakes. Let's move on to figuring out how many pins you need. No doubt a few of you are thinking there's nothing to even talk about here because the names of the connectors literally tell you how many pins you need, and then it's just a matter of doing the math. But I'll just go through a few of them quickly. Molex is 4 pin, SATA is 5 pin. It does depend on the SATA connectors you are using. Some of them have the pins inbuilt. And you need to be thinking about the fans you are going to use. Are they 3 pin or 4 pin? And just one example of how to figure this out. If you have 20 fans and they're all 4 pin PWM, well then it's 20 times 4, which is 80 pins. So I think that covers the pins. Let's move on to the connectors, which are a little bit more complicated, but most of it is quite simple. It's just a matter of knowing how many of each cable type you have, and then you'll know the connectors that you need and the amounts of them. But what makes it a little bit more complex is the connectors on the power supply side, but this is something I talked about in part 1 of the custom wiring guide, which is called components. But for example, you can see here the 24 pin is split into 2 different connectors, and over here on this power supply, the 24 pin is hardwired, but you can see the PCIe connections are what looks like 12 pin connectors. And so you need to know what power supply you have, and you need to know what those connections are on the back of the power supply so that you can figure out what all of the connectors are. Because, on the component side, well, almost everyone is going to know that. It's very easy to figure out. It's the power supply side that makes things a little bit more complicated. Finally, let's move on to cable combs. Now, it wasn't so long ago that we weren't even using cable combs, and now they've become extremely popular, and I actually wouldn't build a system without them now. They're just awesome. And these cable combs are just beautiful. These are the new ones from IceMods. Some of the highest quality cable combs, well, the highest quality I've seen. They look great. So I make a rule of a cable comb every 100 millimeters. Now you can see mine are a bit closer than that. They're probably 80 millimeters apart on this 24 pin. But the thing is, you don't need cable combs for the full length of the cable. For example, on the 24 pin, most power supplies have a terrible pinout, and that crisscrossing from the terrible pinout needs to be sorted at some point. So the last 200 millimeters of the cable is just all of the crisscrossing being sorted out. Now it's really clean on this cable because I've had the power supply casing apart, I've soldered on new wires, I've completely modified this cable, and so I was actually able to sort out some of the mess inside the power supply. But this is as good as I could get it because it was so tight in there, I couldn't actually sort out any more of the mess. But this is a lot cleaner than it would normally be. But another example, the 24 pin cable for the AX1500i. So if this had cable combs on it and I pushed all of this crisscrossing and mess, there's going to be a part of the cable where I can't have combs, and this cable is divided as well, so obviously past this point, no cable combs. And for really long cables, generally the 8-pin EPS and 4-pin ATX are going to be super long. Well, obviously you don't need combs for the full length of those cables. You pretty much don't even need combs at all for those cables because there's only one little part of it that is actually going to be in view. So it really depends if you care about things looking clean around the back side of your build, the cable management. So, you could just have 4 combs per cable. That is enough to cover everything that is in view generally. But if you want things to be clean around the back as well, your cable management, well then it's 1 every 100 millimeters. What we've learned is that you can figure out exactly what you need for the custom cables for the core components right at the beginning of the build. All you need is the case, the motherboard, the graphics cards, and the power supply. And then you can figure it out down to the millimeter, down to the pin. But that is only part of it. In some extremely high-end water-cooled systems, that is only half of it. And figuring out the rest is really more difficult than anything else. So I've talked about fans briefly. I mean, it's just a matter of knowing whether they're 3-pin or 4-pin and how many fans you have, but that doesn't tell you the lengths of the cables. That is something that you are not going to be able to figure out until you have those fans installed, until you figure out if you're going to be running them from a fan controller, an Aquero, a splitter. I mean, there are things that you can figure out up front, but the cable lengths you just can't. That also goes for hard drives, SSDs, pumps, lighting. You can figure out generally how many connectors and pins you are going to need because, you can say, okay, I have, one pump in this build, so that's one Molex connection, depending on how you want to run it. So that's 4 Molex pins. So you can go through and calculate all of that. It's more the cable lengths and the sleeving lengths that you don't really know. So the only thing that you can do is just order a lot more. And I've actually created some custom wiring bolt kits on the Singularity Computers store, which, are a great example of what you are going to generally need for a water-cooled system. So I think we've pretty much covered everything. I mean, there is just so much more to talk about with custom wiring, and I really feel like, talking a lot more about this, I feel like I've missed so many things. But anyway, that sums up this video. I hope it was useful. Thanks for watching, and remember that none of this would be possible without our patrons.